Hi, I'm Brady Hill, the founder and CEO of Courtroom Animation. In this week's episode, I'll be talking about the Amir Locke case, an officer-involved shooting that occurred about 3 weeks ago in Minneapolis. I want to start off by saying that I won't be talking about no-knock warrants or police practices or use of force, as that's not my area of expertise. What I will be talking about is how best to present body-worn camera footage so that the viewer, ultimately a juror, can make the most informed decision with the best understanding of the event. This is Fireside Forensics. Now, when it comes to understanding footage captured by a police-mounted body camera, the two most important factors are understanding timing and perspective. Now, watching these videos once and drawing conclusions is a very narrow way of understanding an event. Granted, there is something to be said for watching the videos in real time to understand just how quick these events unfold. Here's the body-mounted camera footage of the shooting played in real time.
Police search for it! Police search for it! Police search for it! Hands! Get on the ground! Get on the fucking ground!
One of the pieces of software that we use frequently for video enhancement and analysis and recreation is Adobe After Effects. There are a lot of different tools within Adobe After Effects that are effective for presenting body-worn camera footage, such as adding timers, increasing brightness and contrast, slowing down time, adding annotations, and various other tools that allow these very fast-paced shooting events to be viewed in a way that's easily understandable. Another useful tool in a program like After Effects is being able to see when shots are fired in an audio histogram so that we can understand exactly when in time they occurred. One of the simplest and most effective tools for understanding videos like this is a timeline. When I view the Amir Locke video in After Effects, I can see the entire extent of the video in a timeline. There are 14 seconds that occur before the first shot is fired. The video begins with the officers entering the residence. About 8.5 seconds before the first shot is fired, one of the officers announces the warrant. Between 8.5 seconds and 3.2 seconds before the first shot is fired, the officers announce very clearly 5 times that there is a warrant. The useful thing about a timeline, especially when we can see audio signatures as well, is that we can map when those audio events occurred and see them in relation to the video that's being captured. I've created several red layers that show the times when the police are announcing the warrant. We can see that the first announcement of a search warrant began and completed before any of the officers were in the residence. The second announcement of a search warrant occurred when there is one officer inside the residence. The third announcement of a search warrant occurs when there is one officer inside the residence as well. Now I can move forward and map those different vocal occurrences so that they can be seen in relation to any other event in the timeline. This is very effective in understanding when announcements are made versus other events like when shots are fired. As I move forward in the video, I come to a point in time where a firearm is first visible in Amir Locke's hand. What's useful about seeing that and having a timer also available is that we can see when in relation to the first shot being fired, we can first see that weapon in Amir Locke's hand. In this case, it's about 0.9 seconds. Now, when we begin to talk about things like officer perception reaction time, those numbers are incredibly useful to have as to when certain things are visible versus when the next action occurred. What I've done here is match up the audio signatures in the histogram on this layer to some yellow layers that denote those shots being fired above that layer. Here's an example of a timeline that we created for another case. In this case, there were several officers that fired several shots in a very small amount of time. I was able to correlate audio signatures with several different body-mounted cameras to understand exactly when each officer was firing their service weapon. That is an extremely important piece of information to have, especially when we're talking about what officers have the ability to see from different perspectives, different distances, and with different information themselves, depending on where they are in the environment at the time of the shooting. You can imagine how a timeline where we can see when each officer fired their service weapon, tied to something like an overhead view, where we can see those officers' positions, and when they fired based on different events that were occurring at the time of the shooting. When you compare that type of information to something like X officer fired 5 shots during the event and Y officer fired 3 shots during the event, you can begin to understand how these types of exhibits give the viewer such better context and understanding of the event. Now, going back to the Amir Locke case, we can tell that the officer to the right of the officer that's wearing this particular body-worn camera is the officer that fires at least the first shot. I know that to be true because in this particular frame, I can see the slide of his service weapon moving backwards, and that occurs at the same time that one of the shots can be seen in the audio signature. And the slide on the handgun moves backwards almost simultaneously with a bullet being ejected from the muzzle. So we know that the first shot is fired by this officer right here. What's important about that is this officer's perspective. Moving back 0.9 seconds before the first shot is fired, this is the first frame where we can see the firearm in Amir Locke's hand. This officer right here likely sees the gun in Amir Locke's hand before the body-worn camera sees it. What that officer had the ability to see before he fires his service weapon is extremely important. Now, to quantify what that officer had the ability to see, we would need to recreate this event. Now, we can do that by tracking the body-worn camera and figuring out where that camera is in time in a 3D environment. Once we have a recreation of the camera and its position in time in a 3D environment, we can begin to recreate the positions of any of the officers as well as Amir Locke within that 3D environment. Once that occurs, we can put cameras exactly where those officers' eyes are and see what they had the ability to see at any given point in time. At this point in time, I would have to assume that this officer has a better vantage point of what Amir Locke is doing than the body-worn camera. This officer has at least 1 second to see the gun in Amir Locke's hand and take some action. When we talk about perception reaction times for officers, we're talking about time frames between 0.7 and 1.5 seconds. So this approximate 1 second that this officer can see Amir Locke certainly falls within normal perception reaction time. And the officer is able to see what Amir Locke's doing, analyze what he's doing, and then take some action. Now, coming back to the timeline, we could certainly add a layer where we would show that perception reaction time. This would allow the viewer to understand the perception reaction time between when the officer first saw what Amir Locke was doing and when he fired his service weapon. Now, going back to what would allow a viewer or a juror to have the best possible understanding of this event, a timeline would certainly allow the viewer to have a very solid understanding of when events occur in relation to each other. A 3D recreation is the ultimate exhibit in allowing the viewer to understand perspective, timing, and potentially why someone took the actions that they took based on what they saw. A 3D recreation could show that Amir Locke was moving his gun into a more threatening position, or it could show the opposite. And these are the types of questions that are almost impossible to answer without these types of exhibits being created. If a 3D recreation is created in an accurate, scientifically based manner, these questions can be answered. Here are a few other examples of officer-involved shooting cases where we've recreated the footage either from body-worn cameras, surveillance footage, or mobile phone footage to understand a better perspective. This video is from a presentation I did for the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. You can see here how body-worn camera footage can be first tracked, then recreated, then shown from any perspective. This animation is a recreation of surveillance footage where a large group of officers in Chicago fired at a moving vehicle. What was once poor surveillance footage is recreated and shown from an officer's perspective and allows a viewer to see the chaotic and violent nature of the incident. In this case, we had to track and recreate very poor cell phone footage that was moving similar to the way that police body-worn camera footage would be moving. It is easy to understand the benefit of how a viewer can really understand an event from a 3D recreation as opposed to what was once just very poor cell phone footage. These types of exhibits are incredibly effective at taking what is usually poor video footage and turning it into easily understandable 3D recreations that are founded in science. Thank you for watching this video. If you like this content, feel free to like the video and subscribe to this channel.